I want to introduce Danny Pearlstein, who is one of the staff members at Riders Alliance. Danny started advocating for better transit in high school and developed his passion for politics and organizing while working in neighborhood groups and city government. He previously worked as a staffer at the New York City Council and as a lawyer representing injured workers and low-income tenants. And I know I was talking to some folks over breakfast about sort of like the history of the wins that people have been able to win throughout time. And so I'm really excited to hear from Danny today a little bit more about that history. So can we give it up for Danny, everyone?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I'm so excited about this. I feel like Salma really raised expectations. I found the work fascinating when I put it together, and I hope that you do too. So just a quick sense of how this works. Nope. No.
Like our transit system sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Unexpected.
Does anyone know how I can click through the slides?
I
I don't know. Am I aiming at something?
Myra went to get help.
Oh.
Thank you.
It's coming.
That's the present of transit activism.
It's gonna be so great.
I do the past. I mean, I turned it off.
Okay.
Turn it off. Back on. Next. All right. Okay. So, I imagine I'd be able to see this a little bit better than I am. But for 2 centuries, our transit system has moved millions of people. We've undergone constant change and confronted constant crisis, right? The transit system has never remained the same. It's built out, it's gotten better, it's gotten worse, it's gone through unrelated crises, like serving, as a substitute housing or serving as a substitute stormwater system. And, for more than 10 years, the Riders Alliance has been around to amplify and elevate and channel riders' voices into the policy-making process that determines whether transit gets better, gets worse, gets more extensive or contracts. And we do that, all of us here and all of our stakeholders not in the room by representing the millions of people who depend on public transit every single day, like Tama was talking about earlier. But, just like the transit system itself, politics and transit advocacy, transit activism goes back to the beginning. In New York, we had our Rosa Parks a century before the Montgomery bus boycott, right? In 1854, Elizabeth Jennings Graham, who was a 24-year-old black Brooklyn school teacher, was refused a ride on the 3rd Avenue Street Railway. And she was kicked off because it was a segregated car, and the police took her off. It wasn't that she had to sit in the back, she wasn't supposed to be there at all, but she sued and she won a judgment. She won a historic judgment. She was represented by a future president, Chester Arthur, and a Brooklyn judge found that as a common carrier, the 3rd Avenue Railway had every obligation to take her where she needed to go. And that race was an invidious classification as we know it to be today. And that there were certain cases where you don't have to let somebody on if they're drunk, they said, if they're dangerous and committing violent acts, or if they're carrying a contagious disease. But she, like every other Brooklynite, deserved access, barring those issues. So she was there. And then in 1873, and I'd be so curious to learn more about this, at the end of Reconstruction in the South, New York and Albany passed our Civil Rights Act. And we put on the books the same thing that the judge had written in his decision, that people cannot be denied access to public transit on the basis of that. Moving into the 20th century, there was major labor activism all across New York in the early 20th century, and everybody knows that today. We're experiencing another wave again now. But the Transport Workers Union was created, the one that represents 41,000 subway bus operators, maintainers, et cetera today, was created in the 1930s when the subways were mostly privately run, privately operated. And it was a largely Irish immigrant workforce who won the initial union contracts and benefits against the Inter-Borough Rapid Transit, the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Company. But this picture, which I love, is from 1941, immediately after unification, when the old private lines had gone bankrupt and the city took over. And it is women participating in a labor action against the newly consolidated transit system. And if you look at the signs carefully, they're fighting both for a living wage and for equal pay, which I think is incredibly important here, right? That everyone who has a job in transit should be paid, you know, and dignified and honored as a deserving person, but also that they should be able to support a family. That it's not an equal pay as a race at the bottom, it's equally good pay as a race at the top. And transit workers, they struck in the 1930s just like auto workers, and they won the right to unionize, union recognition, and they stopped firing through union organizing. And that, you know, over the several decades since then, in the you know, major strikes in the 1960s, in 1980, in 2005, they won a middle-class existence for our transit workforce, which is somewhat unusual in this country, and in particular after the pandemic, a lot of transit agencies emptied out because their workforce was so poorly paid around the country, and we did not have that issue nearly to the same extent they had elsewhere. We had crew shortages. Other places have, you know, to this day, immense difficulties in hiring because people don't want to pay, in particular, bus operators enough. Moving forward to the sort of post-civil rights era, you know, one of the things that happened, obviously, you know, was that the city lost a lot of population. It lost a lot of taxpayers. A lot of people moved out, and a lot of funding was pulled out of the city. And the result was a transit system that actually was on the brink of collapse. And the Strat-Congress campaign emerged during that era, shortly after the New York City almost went bankrupt, right before the advent of the first MTA capital program, to demand better for riders and a future of more riders and a more reliable system. And they started out opposing, you know, at the time were steep fare hikes coupled with steep service cuts, drawing attention to policy issues, drawing people out in traditionally vocal and politically salient areas of the city, like the Upper West Side. You know, they issued sort of a series of big blockbuster reports throughout their, you know, time in existence, continuing to today, on cleanliness of the system, on timeliness of buses. And I really like this this clip because I think it draws attention to sort of what the Strat-Congress campaign is a part of NYPIRG, which is a Ralph Nader inspired organization. And like Ralph Nader on, you know, auto safety in the 1960s and so many other issues, the Strat-Congress campaign by the 1990s was two very loud voices for 5 million riders. And of course, the voices they're talking about, one of them belonged to Gene Rushinoff, who ran Strat-Congress for you know, most of its existence, and the other is Joe Rappaport, who today runs the Brooklyn Center for the Independence of the Disabled, and is still a very loud voice, you know, for probably 1 million riders and would-be riders who would use the transit system if it wasn't exclusionary to people who have trouble with stairs. So that legacy continues. Another, this is a short-lived and not very well-known chapter in transit history, but I think it's really important, is that shortly before the Rider Lines came into existence, Transportation Alternatives mounted a so-called Rider Rebellion. It was run by Ya-Ting Liu, who is at present the director of the public realm of the city of New York. And it was like when we came into existence, it was timed around the service cuts and the fare hikes that dated after the Great Recession, after the 2008 financial crisis. And the focus, there was somewhat Strat-Congress-like, right? There was this award given to the smelliest station, which I think is probably something you would not do. But going to the bottom, you know, borough-based organizing, right? In the same vein as Transportation Alternatives organizes, you know, street safety activists and cyclists, they were organizing transit riders, you know, in that critical period right before we started up. And they did do a survey, I think at the time, like somewhat like our L-Train survey and other things we've done that supported the MTA's somewhat longer overnight closures to avoid the endless, you know, service changes that we know still exist on the weekends. That is still, you know, sort of an issue. And so this is the lineage I think that we find ourselves in, which is something that's really robust: the history of civil rights activism, of labor activism, of consumer activism. I realize I left one slide off, which would have been great, which is, you know, storied in transit history in New York, is that for 44 years the fare was a nickel. There were no fare hikes in the first 44 years of the subway system. And some people blame the system's current decrepitude in part on that, and it's really hard to say, but I think what it really is a testament to is the immense consumer movement that existed in New York in the period in which the city was becoming more equal, and now is revived in a period in which the city is fighting, you know, extreme inequality. There's a movement of consumers the signal achievement of the consumers movement is rent control, obviously, but the nickel fare for 44 years, also is a testament to that. And we were just talking the other night about a 4% fare hike, but there, in fact, in 48, and I think again in 53, there was a 100% fare hike, and then another 100% fare hike. And so we're obviously in a different place. But I want to talk briefly about the campaigns that people in this room are very familiar with, and the policy achievements they've won. And the first is fair fares, right? 5 years ago, we, working with expert partners and allies in social justice movement throughout the city, created the Fair Fares program, which now has 300,000 people enrolled, living at or below the federal poverty line. This year we won more funding, and for the first time a promised increase in eligibility, and now we're fighting to make that increase as meaningful as possible for as many low-income New Yorkers as possible. Better buses, obviously 2019 at this point may look like the high water mark for the Better Buses movement, but we are determined to see another one much higher, where we won the Better Buses Action Plan from the de Blasio administration, which delivered a number of key busway projects in the next few years, and Corey Johnson spearheaded the passage of the Streets Plan Law, which requires those 30 miles of bus lanes every year, and we will get there. Obviously, we shifted gears. I think overall the country, the movement for transit around the country, both shifted gears and grew in response to the kind of do or die moment for transit when people had to stop riding in very, very large numbers for the first time ever because of the pandemic, but won a historic amount of federal operating aid, right? For decades, the federal government has built transit systems, right? It built, the Washington Metro, it built the MARTA in Atlanta, it built the BART. It has built the Second Avenue. So, there's major pieces in New York that have been built. Obviously, most of the subway precedes the kind of federal investment we've seen. But this was the first time in 2020 and 2021 where we got tens of billions of dollars to run buses and trains, to pay transit workers to operate, to keep the lights on, to buy electricity, to buy fuel. And that's historic, and that's, there's now, a movement to secure much greater operating aid on a sustained basis that's come up from people in Congress. So we are excited about that. And the last piece, of course, is congestion pricing. And I think I've dated it 2014 through 2024. I think 2014 marks the year, and I think Pedro, you were there, correct me if I'm wrong, where riders rode the subway with the cutboard cut out Andrew Cuomo.
Yes. I think it's from Times Square to Court Square in Queens along the Center Line and back, basically. Reason why is because Jose Martinez, who was the reporter from New York One at the time, wanted to get a good story out of it. Now he's a transit beat reporter for the city. Very, that's the high watermark for persuade Cuomo to implement congestion pricing and stay addressed in 2019.
Well, I was going to say it was the Cuomo's MTA hashtag.
Yes.
So riders rode with a cardboard cutout of the governor after he declined or ignored an invitation to ride and see their unreliable situation in the subway. He didn't do it, obviously. The cardboard cutout rode instead. There were further efforts successful to pin it on him as a crisis that he needed to address as the person who's accountable for the operation of the MTA. And that was, of course, the creation of the hashtag Cuomo's MTA to tie it together. I think we are still at that point. But congestion pricing, is been approved by the federal government. Obviously, it was passed by the state legislature in 2019 after, the largest ever transit rider lobby day. I think 2 whole buses came up from New York City to push for congestion pricing, and there was a lot of other groundwork laid, of course. But congestion pricing is a policy that we call a win-win-win, that it will make our transit system much more reliable and accessible than it is today by paying for elevators, paying for new signals in subway cars. That it will, we used to work a block away, we would just sit and we couldn't have meetings in our office because of the gridlocked ambulances 18 stories below. It will address some of that crisis as well and help improve the air quality in the city. And with the mitigation steps being taken in the Bronx, the air will be much, much better than it would have been without congestion pricing at all. And it's something that never would have come about without it. So we are immensely excited for that to happen. And the last thing I want to talk about is our sort of most recent campaign work this spring that resulted in more frequent off-peak subway service, or will, on 14 subway lines by next summer. And this is a campaign that's really grown out of the pandemic, out of the reflection that transit needs to do different things than it used to do. It needs to serve better in the off-peak because there's a flatter ridership, and it needs to do more to attract people into the system because it can't count on the idea that millions of people must show up in an office every day, without a second thought. So the transit system is leveling up, right? We were back on our heels, but actually the state has infused an historic level of funding into the MTA, not just to keep buses and trains running, but to run trains more. And that is a result, I think, of so many different forces coming together, both the management agency, the PWU, which was rallied with us outside Grand Central Terminal in Muskogee, of Myra, and PWU. And this is a historic achievement, and I think that it's important to reflect. It also comes, I think, on the heels of last year's state budget, which included new funding for transit systems upstate as well. And so it's not just New York City, it's the whole state recognizing the importance of transit coming out of the pandemic, a sort of paradoxical moment where even though ridership is not quite what it was beforehand, riders are more visible than ever. And the need for transit to move riders around, to get to essential work, and to get access to basic services is more apparent than ever and has moved people. And we hope will continue to move people all across the state, not just physically moving, but move people to action and move the people that we hold accountable to action on behalf of better and better transit. So I want to pause there. I think we have some extra time. If people want to jump into the conversation, we'd love that.